Welcome to this Easy GUI tutorial video. In this video we're going to be covering how to use panels, and we're going to go into animating the panels, and we'll cover a couple of other topics as well. So let's get right to it. I'm going to go ahead and add a panel to this scene by adding an empty game object, and then I'm just going to add an interactive panel script, and this time I'm going to use the component menu. Easy GUI populates the component menu with the various classes that come with it. And we'll give it a basic name here like panel. And what an interactive panel does is, for one, it allows you to drag it around if you check the draggable box. You can see here. We'll go into that a little bit later. But it also responds to input to a certain degree. It detects when the mouse rolls over it. It detects when the mouse leaves the area, things like that. And you can use that to put controls on it and then, for instance, have an interactive toolbar so that when you put your mouse over the area where the panel exists, it'll pop up so you can see the buttons on it, and then it'll slide back out of the way to save space on your screen. And that's what we're going to do right now, is create kind of a hideable dock-ish toolbar. So the next step is we'll add some buttons to our scene. I had these sitting in a prefab so I could save some time. So we have our buttons all set up and lined up, and what we just want to do is move these buttons into the panel, make them children of the panel, and that way they will move with the panel when the panel moves. So for our panel to detect our input, we're going to need to add a collider. So we'll go to the component menu and add a box collider to the panel. And we'll go into an orthographic view here so it's easier to size our collider. And we'll just make it fill the area where the buttons are. Now what we're going to do is this panel is actually going to bounce into place using an elastic effect. And if we don't make the collider large enough, what's actually going to happen is it will bounce beyond the point where our mouse passed over it, and the panel will think that the mouse has moved off and it'll go back. So what we want to do is actually put some extra size onto this collider at the bottom, so that when it bounces, it will still be underneath the mouse. Now the other thing we want to check is that the collider is not going to cover up the button colliders themselves, thereby making the buttons unclickable. So we can see that the buttons are right here in line with the panel, so we want to actually move the collider so that it's behind the buttons on this side. So we will move the collider back this way, and while we're at it we might as well just make it a little thinner. And now if we hit play, we can see that the button colliders are in front of the panel collider, and that's what we want. Okay, so let's go ahead and at this point test out the dragging feature. So if we mark this panel as draggable just by clicking the drag box, now if we press play, we can see that if we click and drag in the area where the panel's collider is, that we can drag it around just like if it was a window. And what we could do is fill this area in with some graphics. We could use a sprite or something to give it a background, or a header bar that we could click and drag on, and we would have a draggable window or a tool palette. So let's go ahead and turn that back off. Now again, what we're going for is a sort of hideable dock toolbar kind of thing, so that it's hidden normally, and when we move our mouse to the bottom of the screen, it'll pop up and let us click our buttons, and then when we move our mouse away, it'll slide back out of view. So let's have a look at the transition editor. And if you look over here in the inspector, we have our transition editor right here. If you're using Unity iPhone, you'll use the panel editor, which is available under Window and UI Panel Editor. And here you can select the transition that you want to modify. Now, the interactive panel derives from the regular panel class, so it has some of these transitions from the regular panel class, but we're not going to talk about those until later. The ones specific to the interactive panel are these here, where you have normal from over, normal from dragging, over from normal, etc. And what that means is this is the transition that takes place when the panel enters the normal state from the over state. Now, over state is when the mouse is over it, so it's kind of like the mouse over state. And normal is when the mouse is not over it and it's not being clicked or dragged or anything like that. So that means this is going to be the transition that runs when we go from the mouse being over the panel to the mouse not being over the panel. And similarly, the over from normal is when the mouse goes over the panel and previously the panel was in the normal state, meaning no mouse was over it. So those are the two transitions we're going to want to fill in, because we just want the panel to do something when the mouse rolls over it, and then to do something again when the mouse leaves the panel. So we'll go ahead and select over from normal. Now, another concept of transitions is they are made up of one or more elements. And we can add an element here. You can see here where we have a plus button to add an element, and on the panel editor we also have a plus button. What that does is that adds basically an animation effect to the transition. And we can have several of these, so we can actually have a list of various things we want to happen when this transition executes. So we could actually be translating on one. We could go over here and we could have it scale at the same time, and we could have it rotate at the same time, and we can have it do all these things, or we can use the delay property on some of these and have it do all these things sequentially. But for right now, we just want one element, so we'll delete these others. And as you saw, we can choose the type of element we want this to be. There's a whole lot of different things you can choose from. You can look in the documentation under the transition section to find descriptions of all of these. And actually, these are all accessible through script as well. There's a way to trigger these in script if you want to just run one of these on an object, and the object doesn't even have to be an easy GUI object. For instance, the translate or scale or any of these can be used on other types of objects. Now, fade sprite, for example, is something that can only be used on a control or a sprite if you have Sprite Manager 2. But check out the scripting reference and you'll find how to trigger these from script as well. But right now, since what we're wanting to do is to move the bar into view, we want to use the translate type. And we can set a delay, but in our case we just want it to happen immediately. The duration is, in our case, how long we want it to take for the bar to go from its starting position to its end position. So let's have it take 1.5 seconds. And then the easing is basically how it gets to the target value, in our case the target position. And these are all kinds of easing or tweening effects that you can use. Let's do something fun. I'm going to choose elastic out. And then we have 3 types of modes. We have by, to, and from. By will modify the object's current value by the specified amount. So in our case, since we're doing a translation, it will modify the object's position by a vector that we specify here, regardless of where it happens to be at the moment. So we want to use something like this when we don't know where the object's going to be. We don't care where the object's going to be. We just know that we want it to move by a certain amount when this transition occurs. And you'll notice if we change the type to, let's say, scale, then it's going to scale our object by this percentage. The to mode tells it that we want it to go to the specified value from wherever it happens to be. So in our case, we can specify a position in space where we want it to go, regardless of where it happens to be. So again, if we were to use a different type, for example, fade sprite, we could tell it we want it to fade to a particular color from whatever color it is at the time. And the final mode is from to, and that lets us tell the object what value we want it to start out at and then what value we want it to end up with. So in our case, we can specify a starting location and an ending location in space. If we were using Fade Sprite, this could be a start color and an end color. Or if we were using rotation, it would be a start angle and an end angle. So let's go back to translate. Now let's go ahead and specify where we want this toolbar to start and end. So since we have selected the over from normal, what we're going to be telling it is when the bar detects that the mouse is over it, where do we want it to start and where do we want it to end. So the bar, when the mouse first goes over it, is going to be in its starting position just out of view at the bottom of the screen. Now this button here that says current will take the current value of our selected object and populate these fields with whatever that current value is. So we've got it where we want it to start, so we just hit current and it fills in the start position. Now we want the bar to slide up when this transition takes place to right about here, and we'll capture the end position. And now the really neat thing about this is when we start filling in information for transitions, this information is automatically copied to other transitions in this list. So we can select the normal from over transition, and you'll see it has the same values. And it's going to automatically copy these values over until we make a change to this transition, at which point this transition will have its own unique values. But if we want to go back to a situation where all the other transitions copy the settings of this transition, we can click the clone button, and that will copy all of these settings to all other transitions, and then from then forward, as we make changes to this transition, they'll always be copied to the others until we make changes to them, and then they get their own unique values. Okay, so now this is the transition that's going to take place when the panel enters the normal state from the over state. So in other words, when we move the mouse off of the panel, what do we want it to do? Well, we want it to start where it is right now, so we'll click current, and that saves the current position. And then we want it to end up out of view, just like this. And we'll click current there. And now if we press play, you'll see that if we move our mouse at the bottom of the screen, the bar pops out. And if we move our mouse off of the bar, it goes away, just like that. And you can see how these buttons scale up when we put our mouse over it. They use a very similar effect using a scale element. And you see the animation that's taking place there, the blue pulsing background there, as well as the chevrons that move up and down. That's all done with Sprite Manager 2 using sprite animation. But that shows you how to do a animated interactive panel. And next we'll talk about using panels to create menus and wizards.